Under a wide Oregon sky, where the hills rolled like slow waves and morning fog moved like breath over the fields, Melissa Jarrett stood at the edge of the property she had spent the last 2 years turning into something real. It wasn't a farm in the classic sense. There were no livestock, no fields of wheat or corn shimmering in the breeze, but it was alive, in a quieter, deeper way. What Melissa cultivated couldn't be seen from the road. Beneath the roof of an aging, weather-worn barn stood dozens of heavy-duty sacks and barrels labeled with her initials and dates, all carefully cataloged. What they contained was not gold, not even food, but something she considered even more valuable. Bioactive, aerated compost, enriched with a proprietary microbial formula that she had developed after years of experimenting with organic waste and fermentation. The raw material, primarily dried cow dung and hay residue, came from trusted nearby farms. Melissa didn't broadcast this to anyone. She didn't need to. She had all the necessary permits, she followed every environmental regulation to the letter, and her client list, mostly small eco-farms and sustainable gardens, grew by the month. Her operation wasn't flashy, but it was smart. The barn, renovated with a reinforced climate system, maintained optimal temperature and humidity for the controlled breakdown process. Air vents with filters lined the back wall, and a custom drainage system beneath the concrete floor prevented runoff. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't need to be. Melissa had never been one to crave attention or small talk. After walking away from her former career in public sector science, exhausted by bureaucracy and the slow death of innovation, she'd found peace in the rhythms of soil, time, and decay. Her hands, once suited for keyboards and lab reports, now knew the language of fermentation cycles and microbial balance. She liked the solitude. She liked that her work, if unremarkable at first glance, was real. But solitude and silence have a way of making others uncomfortable, especially in small, semi-rural communities where everyone knows how many bags of groceries you carry into your house and what kind of car you drive. Melissa's immediate neighbor to the east was Karen Holloway, a woman in her mid-60s with an intense fondness for structure, authority, and surveillance disguised as concern for the neighborhood. Karen chaired the local residential board, a loose council of homeowners who, while technically lacking formal HOA power, operated with a self-righteous energy that made them feel legally ordained. She had a clipboard for every situation, a laminated binder of bylaws she often quoted from memory, and an unwavering belief that anything she didn't understand was either dangerous or dishonest. From the moment Melissa moved in, Karen had been watching. At first, it was passive. Polite questions asked in that sing-song tone that only ever came from someone already assuming you were in the wrong. So, what exactly do you do in there? I noticed the delivery trucks. Do you run a business from home? Is all that smoke normal? Melissa, always civil, always direct, had answered calmly and truthfully, not because she felt she owed Karen anything, but because she believed in de-escalating. That worked for a while. Karen seemed to lose interest, or at least find another neighbor to monitor, until last autumn, when a particularly windy night had sent an acrid smell drifting downwind. Dry, organic fermentation mingled with the natural must of old wood and decomposing straw. Karen was convinced something illegal was happening. When the compost shipments increased that winter, she became convinced Melissa was storing food supplies, possibly unlicensed grain or export goods. Of course, Karen didn't approach Melissa directly. She began a quiet campaign of speculation, speaking in vague, performative tones at community potlucks and board check-ins. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong," she'd say loudly, "but I do think we deserve transparency. If someone's running industrial storage from a residential property, that affects us all." A few of the other neighbors, mostly retirees who didn't want conflict but also didn't want to appear negligent, began asking questions too. Melissa, unaware of how loud the whispers had grown, kept working. She had deadlines, supply contracts, and barrels to monitor. She didn't hear what Karen was planning. That changed the morning Melissa returned from the farmer's market, tired, distracted, her truck loaded with sacks of straw, and noticed the barn door was unlatched. Her gut clenched before her mind caught up. She always secured the door. Always. Approaching slowly, she could see muddy boot prints leading in, a detail that made her drop the bag she was holding. Inside, the barn was full of voices. Karen was there, of course she was, standing near the fermentation tanks, gesturing dramatically at one of the barrels, while two other people, both middle-aged men she didn't recognize, opened one of the sacks and sifted its contents with gloved hands. "There," Karen said triumphantly. "That's grain. I told you, she's storing agricultural product in bulk, probably for resale. Unlicensed, no doubt." Melissa stepped in, her voice hard and immediate. "Step away from my equipment. Now!" All three turned, startled. Karen recovered quickly. "Melissa, thank God you're here. We were just confirming a concern that's been floating around for some time. I didn't want to escalate it without evidence, of course, but this—" She motioned to the dried, flaky mixture. "This is clearly wheat. Or barley." "That's composted manure," Melissa replied evenly, pulling out her phone and snapping photos of everything. The open barrels, Karen's outstretched hand, the footprints. "Dried dung. You just contaminated a sealed fermentation batch." Karen blinked, lips parting, clearly unprepared for the specificity. "What?" "This is an active microbial compound used in high-grade soil amendment. It's registered, approved, and documented. What you've just done could cost me weeks of work and thousands in contracts. You're trespassing. You've broken a lock, and you've tampered with live biological product." For a moment, no one spoke. One of the men looked queasy and stepped back. The other raised both hands and said, "We were just told to check it." "That's all." "Check it." Melissa turned to him. "Under whose authority?" Karen, now less confident, pulled a folded paper from her tote bag. "There's precedent for community inspection when there's concern about public health or unauthorized use of shared infrastructure." Melissa didn't laugh, but the muscle in her cheek twitched. "This isn't shared. This is private property, on a private lot, registered and rented under state agricultural exemption code. You're not inspectors. You're trespassers." Karen's tone hardened. "We were trying to prevent a larger issue. You don't seem to understand how fragile property values are here." Melissa took a step forward, not aggressive, but immovable. "You just opened a sealed environment containing bioactive agents. If any of you start coughing, vomiting, or worse in the next 24 hours, I recommend you tell the ER exactly where you've been. This isn't playtime, and you don't know what you've walked into." That broke them. The two men left quickly, one muttering something about not signing up for this. Karen lingered, muttering vague threats about reporting irregularities. Melissa didn't reply. She simply locked the barn again, this time with a new padlock, and began writing a timeline of everything that had happened that morning. She emailed it to her lawyer, added it to her record folder, and for the first time since moving to the property, checked the exterior cameras not for wildlife or deliveries, but for signs of people watching. She had built her work around transparency, legality, and method, but now someone had stepped over a line, and Melissa, who had never been one for retaliation or drama, realized something. When someone tries to destroy what you've built through quiet, coordinated pressure, you don't fight back by shouting. You fight by documenting, by filing, by preparing. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. Melissa didn't sleep that night. Even after changing the barn's locks, reviewing the footage, and forwarding every photo and written account to her lawyer, she couldn't shake the feeling of violation. It wasn't just the trespassing. It was the smug certainty Karen carried as she walked into a place that wasn't hers and treated it like a crime scene. Melissa had always believed that if you did things the right way, followed the law, kept to yourself, minded your business, people would return the favor. But that illusion was beginning to crack. The next morning, before sunrise, Melissa was already on the phone with her supplier, requesting a fresh batch of fermentation starter to replace the batch that had been exposed. She didn't want to take chances. Contamination wasn't something you risked in her line of work. She marked the contaminated barrels with red tape, pulled the temperature logs, and wrote a damage report for her insurance agent. There was a process, and Melissa followed it. But as the sun rose and the quiet hills lit up in gold, her inbox chimed with something she hadn't anticipated. A formal letter from the county's Environmental Standards Office. The letter was curt, written in that ambiguous bureaucratic tone that made it difficult to tell if you were being accused or advised. It stated that a complaint had been filed regarding potential improper storage of agricultural waste and/or bulk food material in a non-commercial zone. The notice gave Melissa 5 business days to provide documentation of her permits, waste management protocols, and environmental compliance. Her lawyer, Andrea Feldman, responded immediately, requesting a copy of the complaint. The county clerk hesitated, citing privacy rules, but Andrea pushed. By mid-afternoon, the file was in her inbox. The complainant was listed as K. Holloway. Of course it was. Melissa sat at her desk, staring at the PDF, not surprised but still angry. The complaint didn't just mention improper storage. It included photographs, zoomed-in images of the sacks in her barn, of the ventilation system, even of her front gate. Some of them were clearly taken through binoculars or a zoom lens. One image was a cropped frame from her private property, likely snapped during the break-in. This was no casual complaint. It was a calculated escalation. Karen hadn't just been nosy. She had been documenting, building a paper trail, framing Melissa's operation as a public risk. Melissa printed every page, highlighting inconsistencies, noting errors, adding timestamps and metadata comparisons where possible. Andrea reviewed it all and said the words Melissa had feared. This isn't going to go away quietly. She's building a case, not legally solid, but socially powerful. The following day, 2 county inspectors arrived unannounced. Melissa greeted them with her full documentation: permit numbers, inspection logs, photos of the sealed barrels before the trespassing, copies of her correspondence with Andrea, and a signed affidavit from the landowner affirming that her lease included agricultural activity and temporary storage. The inspectors were polite, thorough, and clearly uncomfortable. One of them, a tall man with sunburned skin and calloused hands, apologized before leaving. "We get complaints all the time," he said, "but usually they're just noise." This one came with a binder. Melissa didn't need to ask whose binder. She knew. Over the next week, the pressure tightened. An envelope appeared taped to her gate, unsigned, no return address, with a flyer inside advertising an upcoming emergency community meeting to discuss unauthorized activities impacting neighborhood safety. Her name wasn't on the paper, but the implication was loud and clear. Around the same time, her compost supplier called to inform her that they had been contacted by someone claiming to be from the local council, asking detailed questions about her purchases. When she asked who, the representative hesitated and said, "A woman named Karen, I think. She sounded very official." Melissa felt something shift inside her. Not fear exactly, but a heightened alertness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a targeted campaign. Andrea advised against public confrontation. "Don't give her an opportunity to make you look irrational," she said. "Respond only through official channels. But if you feel your business is being sabotaged, we can look at legal remedies." Melissa nodded, but her thoughts were already moving. She changed her purchase orders, rerouted deliveries through a third-party warehouse in the nearby town, and asked her primary clients to avoid using her name in public listings temporarily. She wasn't ashamed of her work. She just didn't want it weaponized against her. But it didn't stop. That Friday evening, while Melissa was out inspecting drainage on the western side of the property, she noticed a small group gathered at the end of her driveway. Karen and a few others from the so-called neighborhood board. They weren't on her land, technically, but they were close. Close enough to be seen. Close enough to be making a statement. They didn't wave. They didn't approach. They just stood, watching. Melissa kept walking. The next blow came the following Monday. Her farm's insurance provider called to inform her that an anonymous report had been filed regarding hazardous storage and ventilation violations. The company was obligated to investigate and might need to reevaluate her coverage. "It's probably nothing," the agent said. "Just protocol. But we do need to send someone out." Melissa hung up and sat still for a long time. She could see the pattern now, clearly. Karen was moving the fight into systems, bureaucracy, institutions. Not through formal court action, at least not yet, but through enough procedural disruption to wear Melissa down, discredit her, isolate her. One by one, she was cutting off oxygen. Melissa opened her legal folder, added a section labeled Escalation Timeline, and wrote in capital letters, "This is not about Compost." Because that was the heart of it. Karen didn't care about the smell or the sacks or the licenses. She cared about control, about conformity, about eliminating anything that didn't fit the story she'd written for the neighborhood: neatly trimmed lawns, hobby gardening, polite potlucks, and zero disruption. Melissa, by being competent, quiet, and uninterested in belonging, had disrupted that. And Karen, threatened by what she didn't understand, had decided to make her pay for it. Melissa could feel the tightness in her chest. Not panic, not helplessness, but rage held in check by discipline. She wouldn't retaliate. She wouldn't storm into meetings or scream through fences. But she would respond. She would document, prepare, tighten her defenses. And when the next attack came, and it would come, she would be ready. The rain had started early that morning, a slow, steady drizzle that turned the gravel roads to sludge and painted the hills in muted gray. Melissa stood at the edge of her barn, staring out at the low-hanging clouds, her breath visible in the cold air. She should have been mixing the next round of inoculants for a new fermentation batch or updating her soil nutrient logs. But her focus was splintered. Since the inspector's visit and the mysterious report to her insurance provider, her schedule had been a balancing act between crisis management and damage control. Every day seemed to bring a new inconvenience. A delayed delivery, a canceled order, a vague email from a supplier who didn't want to be caught in the middle of anything. Her business, once growing steadily, had entered a holding pattern. Paused, scrutinized, destabilized by whispers and procedural harassment. It wasn't the market that was undermining her. It was a neighbor with a vendetta and just enough institutional familiarity to stir the waters without getting wet herself. And as Melissa would soon learn, the real escalation wasn't going to come from complaints or cold emails. It was going to come from something far more deliberate and personal. By late afternoon, Melissa had returned inside to begin processing her weekly compliance log updates when her phone rang. It was her landowner, Clint McAllister, a pragmatic, plain-spoken man in his late 60s who had inherited the property from his father but had little interest in farming it himself. Melissa leased a portion of his land under a renewable 5-year contract with the option to buy after the 3rd. Clint had always been supportive. He liked her quiet professionalism, her punctual rent checks, and the way she kept to herself. But now his voice was cautious. "Melissa, I got a call today. Not from you. Some woman. Says she's involved in community affairs." Karen Holloway. "You know her?" Melissa's grip tightened on the phone. "I know of her." Well, she said you were running an unlicensed agi operation and storing food commodities without proper containment. Asked if I knew the lease specifics. Said if there was a breach, the county could classify this as mismanaged land and revoke my ag exemption. I told her she was full of it. But, hell, I'm calling because I thought you should know. I don't like this. Melissa felt her pulse in her ears. Karen wasn't just making noise now. She was trying to destabilize the lease, threaten Melissa's access to the land itself. "Thanks for telling me," she said. "I've got all the permits. Everything's within regulation." "I figured you did, but just between us, I think she's trying to flip the parcel." She asked if I'd consider selling, mentioned some investor group interested in a wellness retreat, said the current use was environmentally inconsistent. She's fishing. Melissa thanked him again and hung up. Then she sat down and let the full weight of it settle. Karen wasn't trying to get her fined. She wasn't just angling for an apology or a zoning citation. She was trying to eject her, evict her, make her disappear. It made sense in a twisted way. A quiet composting operation on a private lot with low visibility and no public engagement didn't fit the curated image Karen had been building for the area. A holistic retreat center, eco-wellness destination, yoga and vinegar bath nonsense. That, to her, was aspirational. And if she could push Melissa off the land under the pretext of safety concerns, all the better. Melissa opened her legal file and began compiling a new section labeled Landowner Interference Attempts. She attached a summary of the call with Clint, added screenshots of her zoning permits, and sent an update to Andrea. Then she moved on to the harder part, speaking with clients. She reached out to 3 of her long-term customers and informed them carefully of the situation. She didn't blame Karen by name. She simply explained that her operation was under unofficial scrutiny and that, while her permits were in place, she anticipated further community pressure. All 3 clients responded with messages of support, though one admitted he might need to source product elsewhere temporarily. Melissa understood. In farming, business moved with the seasons, not sentiment. The next morning, her mailbox held another surprise. A folded, unsigned flyer with bold letters, "Dangerous aerosols? Questionable odors and unmarked barrels next door? Join us at the emergency town discussion. Thursday night." It was stapled to her gate. Melissa didn't touch it. She photographed it, removed it with gloves, and added it to the growing folder on her desktop. But that wasn't all. That evening, just after sunset, she was in her kitchen reviewing moisture readings from a sample test when her security app sent a notification. Movement detected near the rear property line. She opened the feed and froze. A figure was standing just outside her fence line, partially obscured by brush, holding what looked like a flashlight or a camera. Melissa didn't hesitate. She called the non-emergency sheriff's line and reported trespasser activity. The dispatcher said they'd send a patrol car within the hour, but by the time the deputy arrived, the figure was gone. Still, Melissa gave them the footage, clear enough to show height, build, and clothing. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to start a report. The deputy, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and tired eyes, was courteous but non-committal. "Could be teenagers," he offered, glancing at the barn, "or someone curious about your operation." Melissa said nothing. She knew exactly who it was. If not Karen, then someone she had sent. The next day, Melissa purchased 2 additional wireless cameras and installed them facing the fence line. Not because she expected law enforcement to act on her behalf, but because she needed a record, a pattern. On Thursday, the day of the so-called town meeting, Melissa stayed home. She had no interest in walking into a room of whispers and accusations disguised as community concern. Instead, she updated her compliance files, printed out a new set of logs, and emailed her lawyer a complete packet. That evening, her inbox lit up with an alert. Someone had mentioned her name in a public Facebook group for the area. She clicked the link and found a post from a neighbor, friendly but naive, asking if anyone knew the truth about the compost lady and the smells. The comments spiraled. Karen replied under her real name. "We're not trying to be hostile, but safety matters. Some residents are just trying to maintain property values. We all deserve peace of mind." Melissa stared at the screen. Safety. Property values. Peace of mind. The phrases were bland enough to appear reasonable but were loaded with implications. Karen knew what she was doing. She wasn't accusing Melissa of anything outright. She was seeding doubt, just enough to make people uncomfortable. It was methodical, exhausting, and effective. By the end of that week, Melissa knew something had shifted. Her isolation wasn't just physical now, it was social. People who once waved from porches now looked away. Conversations quieted when she walked into the feed store, and yet no one had said a word to her face. Not one direct complaint, not one honest question, just distance, suspicion, and the echo of Karen's carefully cultivated narrative. Melissa could feel the burn of it in her chest. Not fear, not quite, but pressure. She wasn't used to being the subject of rumor. She wasn't used to fighting a war she couldn't see. But she wasn't naive either. She knew that silence was a weapon just as much as slander. And if Karen was going to wage this fight through networks, whispers, and indirect sabotage, then Melissa would answer in kind, with documentation, persistence, and an unshakable refusal to give in. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The second week of March arrived with unexpected warmth. The sun cut through the cold edge of the late winter, coaxing new shoots from the ground and drying the mud into cracking sheets across the access road. But Melissa didn't notice the change in weather. Her mind was fixed elsewhere, locked on numbers, updates, and the constant vigilance that had consumed every part of her routine. She now reviewed her exterior footage every morning before breakfast, not for safety, but for legal insurance. Her business logs had grown into something obsessive, entries cross-referenced, signed, and stored in triplicate. She had even begun recording verbal logs into a digital recorder, time-stamped in case someone ever questioned the sequence of her operations. What had begun as a quiet stewardship of soil had mutated into a defensive campaign, an invisible siege brought on not by law enforcement or regulators, but by a neighbor with too much time and too little conscience. Still, Melissa moved forward. The barn was clean, secured, and functioning. Her permit renewals were submitted 2 weeks early. Her temperature control system had passed a surprise inspection with flying colors. In every measurable way, she was ahead. But in the court of perception, she was losing. Her name had become a question mark in her own community. People didn't confront her. They avoided her. Others glanced in her direction with expressions too polite to be honest. She understood the psychology of it. People preferred clarity. And when faced with ambiguity, especially engineered ambiguity, they would always drift toward the version of the story with more repetition, more emotion, more drama. Karen had all three. But the advantage Karen held wasn't permanent. Melissa knew that. And when the break came, it came not from Melissa's pushback, but from Karen's overreach. It started with an email, innocuous at first glance, sent to Melissa's business inbox. The sender was a man named Byron Kessler, a city contractor and engineer. He claimed to be surveying the area for a proposed rezoning initiative tied to green redevelopment interests. The language was vague, overly corporate. He asked if Melissa would be available for a consultation visit about the land usage patterns on her lease. That alone was strange. Melissa's operation was not under review, and she had received no official notice of any such initiative. She forwarded the email to Andrea, who immediately flagged several details. The sender's domain wasn't associated with the city, and the zoning office had no record of any green redevelopment project in the pipeline. Andrea sent a quiet inquiry through one of her contacts and got a chilling answer. Byron Kessler wasn't city staff. He was a contractor for a private real estate group that had recently been engaged by a local investment syndicate to evaluate undervalued land with conflict potential. In other words, he wasn't coming to assess. He was coming to push. Melissa didn't respond to the email. Instead, she sent a cease and desist letter through Andrea's office, citing improper contact and a lack of jurisdiction. 2 days later, she received a phone call from Clint, the landowner. He sounded tired, irritated. "Melissa, that guy Kessler came by today. Said he was evaluating plots for a wellness retreat. Wanted to discuss land division." I told him to get lost. Told him the place was under lease and not for sale. But I gotta say, this whole thing's getting weird. They're too pushy. If they're not talking to you, they're coming after me. Melissa closed her eyes and let the silence stretch. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Did he mention Karen?" Clint sighed. "Not by name, but he said, community input had identified your operation as incompatible with future use. That sound familiar?" It did. Too familiar. Karen's language filtered through the polished mouth of a paid contractor. This was the midpoint. The moment when the conflict transformed from petty to corporate. The harassment was no longer just social. It was strategic. Karen had taken her complaints, her performance of concern, and packaged it into something monetizable. She had sold a story to investors, probably exaggerating the public backlash, painting Melissa as a liability, and now they were circling like vultures. Melissa didn't panic. She responded. That evening, she began compiling a comprehensive dossier. Not just legal documents, but a narrative. A full chronological report of every inspection, permit, and verification she had received since the lease began. She included photographs, expert statements from her compost supply partners, signed receipts, even emails with regulators who had given her operation clean assessments. She crafted the report not for court, but for exposure, to present if necessary to any stakeholder, journalist, or civic official who might hear Karen's version first. The next day, she delivered a copy in person to the County Zoning Commission's office. Not because there was a formal inquiry, there wasn't, but because she refused to wait for one to be manipulated into existence. She explained the situation calmly, professionally. The receptionist raised her eyebrows at the size of the folder, but took it seriously. Melissa didn't make accusations. She laid out facts. And facts, when organized and timed correctly, could speak louder than gossip. Meanwhile, Andrea reached out to a colleague in the state agriculture office and quietly requested a preliminary review of Melissa's operation. Not as a threat, but as a shield. If Melissa could get a proactive verification from a higher agency, it would neutralize much of Karen's local influence. Bureaucracies trusted official seals more than they trusted neighborhood hearsay. And it worked. 2 weeks later, Melissa received a letter from the state confirming that her facility met all current operational standards for small-scale compost production under the Agricultural Use Clause. No violations. No deficiencies. A clean, stamped confirmation. But the real crack came elsewhere. From within the camp Karen had so carefully built. Melissa had never spoken much to her western neighbor, a woman in her late 50s named Trish who mostly kept to herself. They shared a fence line and the occasional polite wave. But one afternoon, Trish stopped Melissa at the property line. Her expression was conflicted, anxiety mixed with guilt. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Karen came by last week, asked if I'd write a letter to the board saying your compost was causing respiratory issues. Said it'd help the community case. She even had a draft written up already. All I had to do was sign." Melissa said nothing. Trish looked away, shame blooming across her face. "I didn't sign. It felt wrong. I've never smelled anything from your place, and you keep to yourself, but I think she's pressuring others too. Just watch your back." Melissa thanked her. Not with warmth, not yet, but with honesty. Trish had broken the silence, and that mattered. That night, Melissa updated her dossier. She added a new tab: Community Manipulation Attempts. The documentation had begun to feel less like a shield and more like a blade, one she was preparing to use, precisely and without hesitation. The story Karen was building was full of holes, and for the first time, Melissa had a thread to pull. She didn't want revenge. She wanted oxygen. She wanted her name back, and if she had to expose the rot beneath Karen's smile to get it, she would. The early April air was dense with the scent of thawing earth and pollen, as if the whole countryside was waking up and breathing all at once. Yet Melissa's world remained under siege. Even as the seasons moved forward, her situation remained stalled in a manufactured stalemate. Every step she took to reassert control over her land, her business, and her reputation seemed to be met with an equally calculated counteraction. Karen had not backed down. In fact, her pressure had grown more aggressive, more visible, and more strategic. The failed attempt through Byron Kessler and the investor's story had not stopped her. It had simply redirected her. Now, she seemed bent on turning every inch of neighborhood bureaucracy into a battlefield. What had started as rumors and manufactured complaints was evolving into something crueler, more public, more humiliating. Melissa didn't find out about the new wave of attacks from an official source, or even from her lawyer. She found out through a voicemail left by the assistant manager of the local farmers' cooperative, a woman named Renee, who had always been warm and accommodating. In the message, Renee's voice was tight with discomfort. She explained that the co-op board had received a formal letter warning them of possible environmental contamination linked to compost sourced from non-vetted providers. Though the letter didn't mention Melissa by name, it listed enough product, codes, and shipment dates to leave no doubt about who the target was. Renee apologized, saying the board had voted to pause all future purchases from her until the matter could be resolved. Melissa thanked her calmly, professionally, and promised to follow up with documentation. Then she hung up and sat at her desk, staring out the window of her small office until her eyes stopped registering the view. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a deliberate attempt to collapse her revenue stream, to bleed her out financially while keeping her distracted with red tape and procedural nuisances. Andrea, her lawyer, was furious. She filed a formal demand to the co-op board for the origin of the complaint, requesting that they either validate the source or withdraw the action. At the same time, she filed an open records request with the city clerk's office to uncover whether any public health complaints had been filed under Melissa's name. The response came back within 3 days. A complaint had been filed. Several, in fact, all from different names. But when cross-referenced, all of them traced back to the same IP address, the same handwriting, the same linguistic patterns. Andrea didn't need to guess. She compiled the findings into a formal harassment report, filed it with the sheriff's office, and scheduled a consultation with a private legal investigator. Melissa hadn't wanted to go this route. She had hoped that documentation, transparency, and quiet professionalism would be enough to stop the spread of lies. But now it was clear that Karen was never going to be deterred by reason or exposure. She was operating from a different framework, one that valued control over truth, domination over diplomacy. Melissa wasn't just an annoyance to her, she was an obstacle. And obstacles in Karen's worldview didn't just need to be avoided, they needed to be crushed. The investigation began in earnest. The legal investigator, a man named Joel Ward, was a former city compliance officer who now worked as an independent consultant for landowners and small business operators dealing with hostile interference or civic misuse. He met with Melissa, reviewed her documentation, interviewed Andrea, and quickly identified several anomalies. One particularly disturbing detail emerged when he examined the anonymous health complaints filed with the county. Each included an attached document purportedly from a community wellness committee that did not legally exist. The header was fabricated. The signature block was a vague scribble. And yet the county had processed the complaints without verification, likely because they didn't want the liability of ignoring something that appeared medical in nature. Joel dug deeper. Within 2 weeks, he traced one of the fake complaint accounts to an address registered under Karen's late husband's business. The implications were chilling. Karen wasn't just weaponizing public systems. She was using ghost data and outdated records to launch attacks from behind a veil of legitimacy. And it was working. Not because it was clever, but because it was just believable enough to make people doubt. Just complex enough to make institutions hesitate. Melissa had been right to prepare her files and her evidence, but now she understood that preparation wasn't enough. She needed to act. Together with Andrea and Joel, they prepared a civil action plan. Not a full lawsuit yet, but a series of legal filings and formal objections that would begin laying the groundwork. Simultaneously, Melissa reached out to 2 key clients and shared, off-record, the situation. Both were stunned. Both offered support. One even agreed to issue a letter verifying the cleanliness and efficacy of her compost product, attaching lab reports and photographs from their test sites. Melissa attached these to her online portfolio and made them public. She didn't mention Karen. She didn't need to. The truth had a smell, and it wasn't manure. It was clarity, documentation, process. But the confrontation was not done. One night, at just past 11 p.m., Melissa woke to the sound of movement near the barn. Not subtle. Loud, clumsy, panicked. She grabbed her flashlight, her phone, and quietly stepped out the back door, slipping through the side path that bordered her water tanks. As she approached the barn, she saw it. 2 figures moving quickly, one darting behind the compost barrels, the other yanking something from the wall, an exterior sensor. Melissa turned on her flashlight and shouted. The beam froze one of them, a tall man in dark clothing holding a small tool bag. He dropped it and ran. The second followed. Melissa didn't chase. She didn't need to. Her cameras had caught everything. The footage was clear. The time, the movement, the angle. But more importantly, the man who had dropped the tool bag had left behind his phone. It wasn't locked. Inside were text messages, dozens of them, most vague, a few more specific, and one that made Melissa's blood turn to ice. Wait until she's asleep. Rip the damn cables. She can't monitor what she can't see. Just make it look like vandalism. K. That was enough. Melissa gave everything to Andrea and Joel. The sheriff's department was contacted. Charges were filed. And Karen, for the first time, was pulled into something she couldn't smile her way out of. The next 2 weeks moved like molasses, but with devastating precision. Karen denied everything. She insisted the messages were faked, that she had never hired anyone, that she was the victim of a targeted smear campaign by a rogue operator trying to destabilize community harmony. But her words didn't land like they used to. Too many people had seen too many signs, too many patterns. And Melissa, for all her quiet resolve, had done what Karen had never expected. She hadn't broken down. She had built up, and now her foundation was stronger than ever. The district attorney's office declined to prosecute Karen criminally, citing insufficient direct proof. But the civil case was greenlit. Melissa filed for damages, citing lost revenue, defamation, interference with business operations, and emotional distress. The investigators' findings, the texts, the forged complaint documents, all of it formed a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Karen, under pressure, resigned from the neighborhood board. She issued a vague letter about needing time to focus on personal matters. But the damage was done. Her allies disappeared. Her credibility was ashes. And Melissa, still standing, still working, still cleaning her compost barrels by hand, knew the war wasn't about winning court battles. It was about removing the mask. The night after the resignation, Melissa stood at the edge of her property, watching the wind ripple across the fields. The barn was quiet. The lights inside glowed like something sacred. She thought about every step that had led here. The inspections, the trespass, the flyers, the silence of neighbors, the cowardice of bureaucracy, the violent, clumsy attempt to destroy her work under the cover of night. She thought about how long it had taken to be believed, how much documentation she had needed just to counter a lie. But she wasn't bitter. She wasn't broken. She was certain. And certainty in a world full of Karen's shadows was a rare and powerful thing. By the time summer arrived, the silence around Melissa's property had changed its tone. It no longer hummed with suspicion or accusation. It felt emptied out, abandoned, stripped of the invisible presence that had stalked her for months. But the absence of noise didn't mean the storm had passed. It meant the air had shifted in preparation for a final reckoning. The resignation of Karen from the neighborhood board might have signaled a retreat to most, but to Melissa it was something else entirely, an attempt to slip out of view before being forced to answer for what she had done. The civil case, while moving forward, had stirred deeper waters than Melissa expected. Through the legal process, her team discovered something that reframed the conflict completely. Karen had initiated not just one but 3 real estate assessments through proxy names, submitting speculative valuation requests for Melissa's leased land. It was no longer a question of whether Karen had been trying to push her out for personal reasons. It was confirmed now that financial motivations were driving the campaign. The most damning evidence came in the form of an internal memo from a small regional development consultancy Melissa had never heard of. Joel had found it while tracing email activity connected to the name used in one of the forged health complaints. The memo was short but explicit. Parcel 12A, current leaseholder Jarrett, flagged for future Phase 2 redevelopment. Action: suppress public visibility. Discredit via informal channels. Contact initiated with KH for local leverage. It was a smoking gun, hidden in a lazy email chain between consultants who never imagined their communication would be discovered. The memo hadn't just confirmed the campaign, it had mapped it. It showed that Karen had aligned herself with a network of speculative buyers interested in transforming the area into a so-called green wellness corridor, complete with a boutique retreat, organic spa, and high-priced eco-lodging, none of which had been disclosed to the county or community. Armed with this, Andrea moved swiftly. She updated the civil filing, adding conspiracy to interfere with contract and intentional infliction of economic harm. She also submitted a copy of the memo to the county ethics office and demanded a hearing. What followed was a cascade. The local newspaper picked up a tip and began asking questions. Though the article didn't name Melissa directly, it referenced a quiet composting business under fire by redevelopment interests, and hinted at misconduct among community leaders. Suddenly, the narrative Karen had built of Melissa as a mysterious outsider with unsafe practices was fracturing under public scrutiny. The timing could not have been more precise. By the end of June, the Board of Zoning and Land Use had quietly opened an internal review into how certain complaints had been processed without due diligence. Joel suspected some mid-level officials were trying to cover their own backs before blame was assigned. But it wasn't the bureaucracy or the media attention that struck the hardest blow. It was what happened at a small community meeting held in the township's public hall, intended as a routine update on neighborhood safety and infrastructure. Melissa hadn't planned to attend. She was exhausted, and the idea of sitting in the same room with people who had once looked through her as if she were radioactive held little appeal. But Trish, the neighbor who had warned her about Karen's attempt to solicit false testimony, called her that morning and urged her to come. "You don't have to speak," she said. "Just be there. People need to see you." So Melissa went. She wore jeans and a clean work shirt, no makeup, hair tied back. She sat in the second-to-last row near the exit. The meeting began as expected. A few notes on road repairs, a new recycling initiative. Then came the section labeled Open Concerns. An older man stood and spoke about tree maintenance. A young couple asked about broadband service. And then, just as the moderator was preparing to close the floor, an elderly woman stood up slowly. Her name was Mrs. Daly. 83 years old, lived alone on the East Ridge, and had barely spoken at any public event in the last 5 years. "I have something to say," she said in a voice that was clear despite its age, "and I hope people listen instead of pretend they didn't hear." The room went still. "I've lived here since 1961. I knew this place when it was dairy country, when every other yard had a clothesline, and nobody gave a damn what kind of car you drove or whether your fence matched your neighbor's paint." She turned slightly toward the back of the room. Toward Melissa. "That woman back there, she works. She minds her business. I don't know what half the fuss was about, but I do know when a neighbor brings over compost samples, explains the science, and helps an old woman's tomatoes grow better than they have in 20 years, that's a neighbor worth keeping." No one moved. "Mrs. Daly went on, "I also know that certain people," and she didn't name Karen, but she didn't have to, "have been stirring up trouble here since they moved in, always with some new idea for a better future that just happens to benefit them first." She looked around. Shame on all of us for listening. Then she sat down. Melissa didn't cry, but something inside her shifted. Not a tidal wave, not a blaze, just a quiet internal loosening, like a rope pulled too tight for too long, finally giving slack. The moderator, a young man who clearly hadn't expected this emotional gut punch, muttered something about moving on. But the tone had changed. People were quiet, thoughtful. No one looked away from her when the meeting ended. A few nodded. Trish gave her a pat on the shoulder. Melissa left without saying much, but her presence had finally filled a space that, until then, had been claimed by absence and assumption. That week, the county board informed Andrea that they had found procedural irregularities in how the environmental complaints had been handled. Though the findings weren't criminal, they were enough to merit a formal redress. The health department issued a clarification publicly, stating that no contamination had ever been found on Melissa's property. The farmers' co-op reinstated her as a supplier. One of her old clients returned with an order twice the usual size, citing customer demand for her product after the article circulated. Even more surprisingly, a local community garden, one that had once canceled an order out of nervousness, invited her to host a weekend demonstration on composting practices. Melissa accepted. The day of the demonstration, the barn was spotless. She brought barrels with labels and explained the microbial fermentation process to a group of curious volunteers, most of whom had never imagined that dried cow dung could smell earthy and sweet when processed properly. She answered every question. She passed around samples. And when someone asked how she managed to keep going after everything, she smiled, just faintly, and said, "Because dirt doesn't lie. People might, but dirt always tells the truth in the end." And so it was. The conflict hadn't burned out in a dramatic court ruling or a public takedown. It had eroded. Eroded through exposure, evidence, and the weight of persistence. Karen was still in town, though quiet now. Her retreat project had lost traction. Investors pulled out. Some of her old allies had distanced themselves completely. And Melissa? She worked. She grew. She stayed. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, but as what she had always been. A woman who showed up, who built to something from waste and patience, and who never let someone else's smallness shrink her purpose. The war was never just about compost. It was about claiming space in a world that tried, again and again, to take it from her. And in the end, she won not with fury or revenge, but with endurance. By late summer, the landscape had settled into its full bloom. Long grasses bowed in the wind along the fence lines, and the fields surrounding Melissa's barn exhaled a slow, steady heat that made the air shimmer like a living thing. The pressure that had once suffocated every corner of her life had receded like a retreating tide, leaving behind evidence of where it had been but no longer dictating the rhythm of her days. Melissa moved differently now. Not cautiously, she had never been timid, but with a sharpened clarity, as though each action was now informed not just by necessity, but by experience. She knew what it meant to be under siege without warning, to have her livelihood turned into a target, her name dragged through manufactured mud, and she knew, with certainty, that none of it had broken her. The civil case continued in the background, slowly grinding through the procedural gears. Karen, now represented by a third attorney in as many months, had shifted from combative to avoidant, offering conditional settlement terms that Andrea advised rejecting. Melissa didn't need money from Karen. She didn't need an apology either. What she needed was a matter of record, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a correction of the paper trail Karen had spent months poisoning. And she was going to get it. Not because she wanted revenge, but because people like Karen depended on the world forgetting. They relied on short memory, on neighbors choosing comfort over truth. Melissa had no intention of letting that cycle repeat itself, yet it wasn't court that closed the story. It was something far more mundane. One morning in early August, Melissa received an envelope. Not a legal notice, not a flyer, just a simple envelope with a handwritten return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The note was from one of the men who had trespassed into her barn months ago during Karen's initial inspection. His name was Marty. He had been the one who sifted through her compost sacks, believing them to be food grain. The letter was brief, but it wasn't cowardly. He wrote that he'd believed Karen at the time, trusted that she knew what she was talking about, that he thought he was doing something responsible for the neighborhood. He admitted that once things escalated, he felt ashamed, but didn't know how to undo the damage. And now, seeing how it all had played out, he wanted to offer his apology, not just for his role that day, but for staying silent afterward. He enclosed a printed statement, signed and dated, formally describing the event and clarifying that Karen had coordinated everything without permission or legal backing. Melissa held the paper in her hands for a long time. It wasn't legal gold. It wouldn't swing a court decision. But it meant something deeper. It meant that the illusion had cracked, that even those who had once followed Karen's lead were beginning to see the cost of complicity, that someone was willing to say aloud what most only whispered, that she had been right and that her refusal to yield had mattered. In the weeks that followed, Melissa resumed work with renewed focus. Her compost batches were back on schedule, her client list growing again. Orders came in not just from within the county but from neighboring regions, where her reputation, bruised but intact, had earned her new trust. She didn't expand recklessly. She didn't capitalize on the drama. She just worked, one barrel at a time. One mix, one sample, one delivery. Quiet progress, steady and true. By the end of the month, Clint stopped by with a contract extension. He didn't say much, he wasn't the kind to talk in circles, but his trust in her was clear. He handed her the paperwork and said simply, "I'd rather this land stay in hands that care about it." She signed, and when he drove off, Melissa walked to the edge of the field and looked at the barn. It was just wood and metal, really. Simple construction, nothing impressive. But inside it, she had buried everything she was supposed to surrender, and from that she had grown something lasting. Her final gesture came one Saturday morning, when she hung a small wooden sign above the barn's side entrance. It wasn't flashy or sarcastic, not a pointed message to her enemies. Just 4 words, hand-painted and sealed with weatherproofing, mounted with care. No grain, just growth. It was her way of marking the end, not of the war, but of the hold it had tried to place on her life. Because in the end, the barn hadn't been a battleground. It had been a proving ground. And Melissa, who had never asked for a fight but never turned away from one, had proved not just her innocence, but her endurance. No media had ever covered her story. No one had written an exposé or made a viral post. And that was fine, because what Melissa had built didn't need headlines. It had roots. It had weight. And in the quiet place where soil turned waste into renewal, she had won. Quietly, completely, and without compromise.